The Quarter Pounder with Cheese had many great things. Maple-flavored griddle cakes isn't one of them. McDonald's breakfast comes first. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You're listening to the Archaeology Show. TAS goes behind the headlines to bring you the real stories about archaeology and the history around us. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Archaeology Show, episode 296. On today's show, I interview Tara Roberts about her new book, Written in the Waters, a memoir of history, home, and belonging. Let's dig a little deeper. Okay, here's a little bit about Tara before we start the show. Tara spent years following, diving with, and telling stories about black scuba divers as they searched for and helped document slave shipwrecks around the world. Her journey was turned into an award-winning National Geographic-produced podcast called Into the Depths and featured in National Geographic magazine. Tara became the first black female explorer ever to be featured on the cover of Nat Geo. In 2022, Tara was named the Rolex National Geographic Explorer of the Year. Currently, she is an explorer in residence at the National Geographic Society, and her book, Written in the Waters, a memoir of history, home, and belonging, is available now, despite what I'm about to say in the interview. Tara also worked as an editor for magazines like Cosmo Girl, Essence, Ebony, and Heart and Soul, and edited several books for girls. She was a fellow at the MIT Open Documentary Lab. She founded her own magazine for women who are too bold for boundaries, and Tara spent an amazing year backpacking around the world to find and tell stories about young women change agents. The journey led to the creation of a nonprofit that supported and funded their big ideas. And now, on to the interview. Welcome to the Archaeology Show. So we have an interview today, as we mentioned last week, and joining us today is Tara Roberts, and she's written a book that will be out for, well, it's out for pre-order right now, so you can pre-order this on Amazon. Check the show notes for a link for that, but it should be available March 4th, 2025. If you're listening to this in the future, hopefully you're clicking that link and ordering it right now, but it's called Written in the Waters, a memoir of history, home, and belonging, and it's from National Geographic Digital. So, Tara Roberts, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. So, this is all about diving and working and just this whole life of working with this. But I want to step back just a little bit. How long have you been diving? How did you get into diving and doing that whole thing? And then we'll get into some other stuff later.
Sure. And I just want to make one note about the book. It's actually out now.
Oh, Amazon still says it's on pre-order.
Well, the digital version, so the ebook is on pre-order, but the book came out on January 28th. So
gotcha. Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
We'll make sure that link is also in the show notes.
Okay, perfect. Well, I will say that I got into this completely by accident. Before I started this work, I was not a scuba diver, and I was also not that interested in history. I know your listeners are probably going to hate me for saying that. But yeah, I'm one of those like sci-fi fantasy future girls who's always sort of looking ahead and not looking back. But this work has taught me a lot. And so my perspective has changed completely. But I'll say that this all started really randomly, again, accidentally, because I visited the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. And there in the museum on the second floor is this really tiny floor that most people skip. But thank goodness I didn't skip it. There I saw a picture that basically changed my life. It was a picture of a group of primarily Black women in wetsuits on a boat. Nice. I had never seen a picture of a group of Black women in wetsuits on a boat before. So I was immediately intrigued. It made me remember my dreams as a kid. Again, I was like one of those geeks that used to read a bunch of books, and the books that I loved were these sort of adventure fantasy books. with characters that were always doing something adventurous in the world. And they were doing something adventurous that had meaning. Like they were often going out to save the kingdom in some way. And I wanted to be one of those characters. I wanted to be somebody that would like live life adventurously and that would help the world in some way. So when I saw this picture, one I'd never I didn't know Black women having a relationship with the water in this way. So it intrigued me. And then when I read the rest of the information that came with the exhibit, I saw that they were a part of this group called Diving with a Purpose. And that what they did was they helped to search for and document slave shipwrecks around the world. And I was like, what? Wait, did I read that right? Wait, what? They do what? I was so intrigued. I mean, who would even think, who thinks about slave shipwrecks? And then to actually have people who are out there trying to recover them. It was fascinating to me. I think I stayed on that floor looking at that exhibit for like an hour. I was just so intrigued. And I ended up Googling them right there in the museum. And then I called them up. And that's how the story went on from there. Were
you a diver before that?
No.
Oh, so you're just like, hey, let's just do this diving thing.
I'm from Atlanta, which is landlocked. I didn't know anything about the ocean at all. I will say that I was a swimmer. Like I loved pools. I loved the water, but I didn't know the ocean. Yeah, that definitely helps. But I didn't know anything about the ocean. I will say I had gone scuba diving once in my life before, and it was probably like 20 years earlier. I happened to be on vacation with my boyfriend at the time, and we were at a resort. And you know how the resort offers you like a scuba experience. So I did it once, and I remember also really having a hard time going down. My ears wouldn't equalize. Like it wasn't an easy experience. But I do remember when I got down, I thought it was just beautiful. So I did have that reference, but I'd not been diving since then. And I'd never really thought about it since then. It really was those women that made me go, oh my goodness, that's amazing.
So the Diving with a Purpose people get this phone call from somebody who doesn't dive, is not an academic, and they say, come on over.
Exactly.
Well, that's awesome. So, I mean, how was it getting into working with them? And what was that, I guess just what was that process like for you? What was that journey like?
Well, so the women that I saw in the picture were all surrounded, or they were surrounding a gentleman on the boat. And this gentleman is an older gentleman who just this year turned 80 years old. So he's incredible. But his name is Ken Stewart, and he is the co-founder of Diving with a Purpose. And it was Ken that answered the phone when I called. And Ken was great. I have to say that the majority of the divers who participate in Diving with a Purpose are not academics or scientists. They are regular lay people who love to scuba dive and wanted to dive with a purpose. But they range from their students, engineers, policemen, yoga teachers. Like it's a broad variety of people who are a part of it.
Do they do this on like a volunteer basis, or is it funded somehow? Okay.
No, they're all volunteers. Nobody gets paid. They really just feel called, I think, by the mission. And so they volunteer their time to do this, which is beautiful. So, I called them up. And at the time, I still, I wanted to be a part of them somehow. But I didn't know if I could or if it made sense. So I sort of called them up with a pretense. I was working for a nonprofit at the time, and Diving with a Purpose is a 501c3 nonprofit. And so I was like, well, maybe they need help with funding. Maybe I can help them get some money. And I am not a fundraiser, but I happen to be working for an organization that supports change makers, and they give fellowships or individual grants to people that are making a big difference in the world. So I just thought, well, Ken started this incredible organization. Maybe I can help him get a grant. So that's how we started our conversation. And we ended up having a number of conversations. He connected with the people at the organization, but it turned out that it wasn't quite a fit. But because Ken and I had so many conversations, we became friends. And at some point towards the end of this cycle, Ken was like, you know, he likes to call me by my full name. So he was like, Tara Roberts, do you know that you live in the epicenter of Black scuba diving? And I was living in DC at the time, and I was like, wait, what? I was like, I live in DC. And he was like, yeah, you live there with all the cats. You are right there in the middle of it all. And I was like, are you kidding? And he was like, no. He's like, why don't you join us? And if you want to, I will get you in a diving class that is starting right now. And it turns out that there is a group or club, a diving club in DC that's called the Underwater Adventure Seekers. And they are the oldest Black diving club in the United States. They are over 65 years old.
Wow.
The person who is credited with being the grandfather of Black scuba diving, his name is Dr. Albert Jose Jones, is the one who founded that club. And then he went on to found the National Association of Black Scuba Divers.
Wow.
So, yeah, I was like, okay, yes, you've given me permission. Yes, I want to be a part of it. So Ken got me into the diving class. And it turns out that it was a serious diving class. I said that, you know, I participated with my boyfriend at a resort like 20 years earlier. And that consisted of, I think it was a day and an afternoon of training. This was 3 months of training. And we were in the pool every week, and we were in the classroom every week. So it was twice a week that we trained for 3 entire months, because they take scuba diving very seriously.
Right.
So I did it. I got certified. And when I went up, so during this whole process, I was getting to know the divers more and more. And I was getting to know more and more about the mission of Diving with a Purpose. Most of the divers who, or I won't say most, but many of the divers who are a part of the Underwater Adventure Seekers were also trained with Diving with a Purpose. So a lot of them had done the training and participated in the work. So during this process, I started to learn more and more about their mission. I learned more and more about the ships that they were finding, and I became even more intrigued. And at some point, I realized that, like, I am trained as a journalist and as a storyteller. That's my world. I'd done a bit of a detour for like a decade where I was in the nonprofit world, but my deepest passion, yearnings are all around storytelling and adventure. Okay. And so at some point, as I got to know the divers, I was like, wow, people should know this story, and they should know what these divers are doing. And then it clicked for me one day, and I was like, oh, duh, hello. Maybe this is a story that I could help tell and get out in the world.
Okay. Well, that is a good point to take a break, because I wanted to transition to the storytelling aspect of this, and we'll do that in segment 2. Back in a minute.
You don't wake up dreaming of McDonald's fries. You wake up dreaming of McDonald's hash browns. McDonald's breakfast comes first. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
Welcome back to the Archaeology Show, episode 296, and we're here with Tara Roberts. So we're continuing our conversation, and you were just getting into the writing aspect of this, which was literally one of my next questions. And I was going to ask how you got into all the writing stuff, but I didn't know you were trained as a journalist initially. Talk about your, before you said took sort of a 10-year break doing your nonprofit work. What kind of journalism did you do before that? I'm just curious. And then, we'll get into what led you into writing about the diving with a purpose activities. But what kind of journalism did you do before that? I'm just curious. Sure.
I was a magazine editor.
Okay.
I worked for magazines like Essence, Cosmo Girl, Heart and Soul. It was mainly women's magazines.
Yeah.
Magazines. So I was an editor and I did some writing.
Okay. Nice. All right. And then you took those skills once you got into diving with a purpose, it sounds like, and said, hey, somebody needs to be writing about this. I'm shocked that nobody was, to be honest with you, but somebody needed to tell these stories.
Right? It seems like, hello, this is amazing. Yes. Yeah. Someone should be telling these stories. And I mean, they did have some stories written about them, but I wanted to go deep with them. So let me be fair. Like, there are some stories about diving with a purpose and about these divers, but I wanted to travel with them around the world, to really be a part of the mission, a part of the work, and to do some deep storytelling. So when I got this idea that I wanted to tell stories about them, I went to Ken and their executive team or their board, and I asked them if I could do this. And they said, sure. And then I realized, again, like, I wanted to go all in, and I didn't feel like I could do that and still do my 9 to 5. So I decided to quit my job so that I could tell these stories. And at the time, I didn't have funding. I didn't have an assignment from any paper or magazine or website. I just felt called. So I went back to Ken and I told him, I was like, Ken, I'm quitting my job so that I can tell your stories. And he was like, oh, wait, no, do not quit your job. We cannot be responsible. And I was like, no, don't worry. I feel like I have to do this. So I did. And to participate in diving with the purpose, you have to get 30 ocean dives under your belt, because the work that Diving with a Purpose trains you on is underwater archaeology mapping. So you're down under the water or under the surface drawing. So you have to have really good control of yourself when you're under the water. So they require you to work on your buoyancy and to get your dives in on the ocean. So when I quit my job, I went to go get my dives in. And while I was doing that, I was like, oh, maybe I need to apply for some funding to be able to help support this. When you run your own nonprofit for 10 years, you don't make very much money, or at least I didn't. I should say that the coffers needed to be replenished at that time.
Yes. Yeah.
So I applied for a grant with National Geographic. I actually applied for 2 grants. I didn't get the first one, but I got the second one. And that grant was a small grant, and it allowed me to travel with the divers. I was able to travel to Mozambique, South Africa, Senegal, Benin and Togo, Costa Rica, St. Croix, and around the US. And my grants with Nat Geo, that first grant, was to support me around writing blog entries about the journey and about my travels. So I did that. first for the first year. But as I was out on the road and as I was meeting all of these incredible people who ranged from the divers, but there were also archaeologists, there were historians, there were park rangers, there were students, there were descendants of people who were on the boat from all of these different locales. And as I was traveling, as I was recording from them, and you might really appreciate this, Chris, but I was recording them in a number of different formats because I didn't know what the story would be. And I just wanted to have it in as many formats as I could. So I took pictures. I had a video camera. I had my audio recorder. And of course I had my notebook where I was taking notes. Quickly, I realized I am not a videographer, filmmaker. Like, it was so stressful worrying about, oh my God, the battery is running out. Do I have all the equipment? Oh, the sun is here. And this looking. I was just like, this is too much for me. I admire all filmmakers that are out there. You guys are incredible. But it was a little too much for me. And what I started to realize, especially when I was writing the blog entries, I would listen to my notes, the audio recorded notes. And I started to hear a story. There was something about all of these different accents, something about the way that they understood this history in their own words that just felt beautiful to me. And so I started to think, I think this is an audio story next. Yeah. So I went back to Nat Geo and told them that I wanted to make a podcast about this journey. And I wanted it to be a narrative podcast, like a limited series podcast. And they got it. And so they gave me additional funding and I partnered. So my grant is from National Geographic Society. And I partnered with National Geographic Media, their audio division, in order to make a podcast called Into the Depths, which is out there. It's still streaming. If anybody wants to listen to it.
I found it. The link is in the show notes if you want to find it on Apple Podcasts, and I'm sure you can find it in other places as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
The podcast tells the story of my journey in 6 episodes, and they're 30 minutes each. And you really get a sense of being out there. It tells the story of 6 of the ships that we found. It tells the story of some of the divers, and it tells a little bit of my journey and some of my transformation. Like, again, I said earlier that I was a person who didn't really like to look back at the past. But by the end of the journey, I was like, wow, there's so much richness in understanding the past and where we came from. So you get to see a little bit of my transformation. So that's was awesome. The podcast that came out in 2022. I still was traveling with the divers, still learning, still growing. And I realized there was still so much more to say. And there was even more about my own transformation. So it just felt natural that the next piece would be a book. And so that's where we are now.
Real quick, I'm just curious, 2022, I was actually a little surprised when I saw that number on the podcast. For some reason, I thought that would have been longer ago. What is the timeline here? What kicked this all off? What year did you see that museum exhibit in Washington, D.C.?
It's so funny that you asked that, because when I look back, I'm like, it has been a really long time. Like, how did this happen? Yeah. But I went to the museum in 2017. Okay. And I started the journey at the end of 2018. That's when I got my grant from Nat Geo. So it's really been since 2019 that I've been on the road telling stories about the divers.
I'm curious, did COVID slow the divers down too much? I mean, under the water, you're pretty much socially isolated. I mean, not up in the ship, but I mean, how much did that really slow everything down? Like it slowed the rest of the world down? I imagine it did, just from a travel perspective.
It did. And
Yeah.
I will say that some of the diving with a purpose divers are diehard divers, and they're like, I got to get in the water some kind of way. So some of them were diving, but a lot of places were closed.
Sure.
And I took a bit of a break then. Like I focused more on the storytelling, like really seeing all of these interviews. I'd say when all was said and done, I had about 100 interviews, hours long each. Like it was a lot of material to go through. So I really spent the prime time of COVID working on the podcast. Really, shaping the material into a story.
Okay. All right. Well, let's take our last break, and on the other side, we'll talk about the book. Back in a minute. Welcome back to episode 296 of the Archaeology Show, and I'm back with Tara Roberts, and we're going to talk about the book this segment, but I had a couple of questions that kind of popped into my head on the last one, and just for a little bit of context here, I was just wondering if just thinking about the slave ships, I mean, we could have a whole session. In fact, I really would like to interview some people with diving with a purpose, actually, because this would be a fantastic topic for this show. But just for some context to bring that in, do you know how many slave ships are estimated to be wrecked out there? Obviously, we probably don't know all of them, but there's probably some estimates out there of the numbers that are out there in the world.
Yeah. Well, they think, or they actually, they don't think this because the numbers are well documented.
Oh, okay.
There are, not of wrecked ships, but there were 12,000 ships that participated in the slave trade over the course of the 400 years of the history of the trade. And they estimate that approximately 1,000 of those ships have wrecked. Wow. And to date, they have found less than 20, and even fewer have been properly documented.
Right.
So it's an area where there is a lot of unexplored history.
Wow, that is shocking. How long has Diving with a Purpose been around and doing their work?
It's funny. Diving with a Purpose has been around for over 20 years. Okay. They started out with the wreck of the Guerrero, which is a ship that wrecked off the coast of Florida. That was the wreck that sort of brought Ken in. And they have spent the last 20 plus years trying to confirm that wreck. I mean, one thing about these ships is that they are notoriously hard to find and they're hard to identify. And that's primarily because most of these ships, were built in the 16th and 17th centuries. So they were built out of wood. And when wood wrecks on the ocean floor, it splinters, it wrecks in pieces. Yeah. And the ocean takes back those pieces. So they're hard to find. Right. Sometimes hard to identify. So that's part of the problem. But the other part of the problem is also like this area of study hasn't been an area of study that's a priority. And so it's sort of both of those things working together. Right.
Yeah. I mean, ships at that time generally don't wreck gently in calm waters. It was probably a storm or something like that. It tore it apart and then, it went down. So or bad navigation, one of the two or both of them. So
it's often both of those things. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So man, that's crazy. Well, talking about the book, let's just talk about, kind of lay out the book for us. What does the book, what can people expect from this book?
The book is, I'd say it's a deeper version of the podcast. You get much more in-depth stories about the ships. And let me tell you, there's some incredible wrecking stories. Like if you just look at it from a pure nautical ship perspective, you got pirate chases, you got mutinies, you got navigational errors. Like it's all of those things, incompetent crew. It's all of those things happening. So I tell deeper stories about the ships. I tell deeper stories about the divers who are, again, like from all walks of life. They are some incredible human beings who, again, have volunteered their time to do this work. So I'm able to uplift some of their stories. And then, probably most importantly, I am telling stories. So this is where I've now embraced the past wholeheartedly. I'm like, oh my God, it's so fascinating. I can't believe I wasn't into this before. But I tell stories about this history, this period between, the 15th or the 16th and 19th centuries. And I tell stories about the people whose lives were lost, but also about the impact of this trade on various communities. Mm-hmm. I also talk a lot about my connection to my own history as a result of doing this work. Like when I started, I really was thinking that this history feels important just from a sort of collective historical record kind of perspective. Like it's just, It helps us understand more of what happened in the past and we should all know it. But I wasn't thinking about this personally, which maybe is a little dumb because hello, I'm a Black girl. I know that my people were enslaved at some point. So clearly there's a connection here, but I wasn't really thinking about that. But the more that I did this work, the more that I talked to people, the more I realized that there's so much life and beauty and incredible stories of resilience and resistance and survival, and even stories of love. Like there's just so much there that I really hadn't considered before. And that's partly because I thought that this history was maybe a bit too painful and too traumatic to really approach. But I learned that it is some of that for sure, but it's complex and it's rich and it's fascinating. And it gave me a way to connect to my own ancestors. Yeah. Yeah. I ended up hiring a genealogist to do some tracing back to see if we could trace my roots back to a slave ship. But that only happened because I met the descendants of the ancestors who were on the Clotilda slave ship. That ship is the most recent ship to be found. It was found in 2019, and it was found in Alabama in the Mobile River. And the descendants of the people who were on that ship, they know their ancestors' stories and can trace their ancestors back to specific villages on the African continent. So they're very unique.
Well, I didn't even think about the fact that there might be survivors, actually. I guess it wrecked close enough to shore that they were able to get out.
Well, with the Clotilda, it's a whole story, Chris.
Yeah, I bet.
It's a long story. I don't think we have time for it. But
probably not.
The brief version of it is that an Alabama plantation owner made a bet that he could sail a ship to Africa.
Oh my God.
After the slave trade had been made illegal, but he was like, he made a bet that he could do it.
Right.
And
of course.
He did it. He built a ship and he sailed it across and he did it and he brought it back. And he had all of the people unloaded from the ship. And then the ship was burned to hide the evidence.
Oh my God.
They burned it in the Mobile River, which is a muddy river. And so the mud ended up preserving the ship. So
thank you, science. Yeah.
It's amazing because that ship is the only ship so far that has been found intact. I know I just said that most of the ships are in pieces on the floor, but this is in a river that is full of mud. And so it is the exception. And it's giving us so much archaeological information. Like, it's incredible to have made.
I'm sure.
Yeah. But so the people who were on that ship survived. They settled in that area. It's an incredible story because they ended up, once they were freed, they bought land. These enslaved people bought land and christened it Africa Town. And Africa Town still exists today. Like, it became an actual thriving community in Mobile, Alabama, that was founded by these formerly enslaved people. So their descendants grew up in Africa Town, and then more descendants and more descendants. So those descendants can really trace the stories of their ancestors all the way back. Yeah. And there was such a sense of pride and just like, they had a sense of accomplishment of their ancestors. And that was one of the things that made me realize that these aren't just stories of pain and stories of trauma, that they're also stories of life and of laughter and of joy and accomplishment. So that gave me the courage to go back and trace my own ancestors back. So anyway, the book tells that story. It's really a memoir that, the subtitle sort of lays it out. It's a memoir of history, but it's also of home. It's of me searching for where do I belong in this world as an African-American woman. Yeah. Then belonging. So who do I belong to?
Well, I will say, I have links for the digital version that's coming out March 4th, the ebook version, I should say. And the hard copy version, which you did tell us is out now. But also I did find and actually ordered and will be listening to the audiobook because I do a lot of driving as an RVer, and we have a lot of international travel coming up in March. So at some point I will be listening, and it's narrated by you as well. So I'll be listening to you narrate the book. I love it when the author narrates the book, and you sound like, your voice, I love your voice. So you're going to be a fantastic book narrator. It's going to be awesome. It'll be great. So I'm looking very much forward to hearing the stories in this book and how this goes. So just one last thing I wanted to ask you about. Well, I guess two things really. First, what's next? Because now that the book is published, it's out there, it's almost fully out there with all the different versions. What are you working on now? Is it anything you can talk about, or, what's next for you in this space?
I can talk about it. I'll talk a little generally though. So Nat Geo invited me to become an explorer in residence so that we could work on part 2 of this project. One of the things that feels really important to me about this history is memorializing this history and also honoring the people whose lives were lost because of it. Right. We didn't really talk about this number on air, but I'll just share this number because it was shocking to me to find this number. And I didn't know this, but there were approximately 1.8 million Africans who died just in the crossing from Africa to the Americas. So we're not talking about the number of people who died on the march to the boats, or the number of people who died once they arrived and were enslaved. Just in the crossing from one shore to the other, approximately 1.8 million people died. So what we want to do is, we want to memorialize that lost. So we are working on a pretty big project that I think will be very exciting to some. Yeah. And I'll say this too, that we don't just want to memorialize this loss, because this story, again, it isn't just a story of the trauma or the pain. This is also a story of connection, because there is a way that Africa, Europe, North America, and South America are intricately interwoven because of the transatlantic slave trade. When you think about the transfer of cultures, of beliefs, of religions, of philosophies, of goods, of people, like all of these things have made us deeply connected to each other, and we're connected in a way that cannot be undone. So when I think of honoring this past and honoring the connection that we have with each other, it makes me wonder that if we see ourselves connected, could that potentially change how we think we're responsible for each other? So all of the work that we're doing in this next phase will be about honoring the loss, but also honoring our connection to each other.
Right. Wow. That's amazing. I love it. Well, this has been fascinating discussion, I got to say, and I really do would like to get some of the people from Diving with a Purpose, I think, on this show as well. That would be great. But
I think I was just going to say, you should get Diving with a Purpose, and one of the key partners of Diving with a Purpose is the Society of Black Archaeologists.
Oh, yeah. And I know a few people in there too. So yeah. So my other question was actually, how did you become a National Geographic Explorer in Residence? You kind of went into that, but it's just, I saw that on there. I was like, man, that's amazing. I mean, you just kind of started this journey not that long ago, and now you're a National Geographic Explorer in Residence. That's awesome. I love it. But we're kind of up on time anyway. But again, one more thing I will say to you, you did a one-off podcast series with National Geographic, but I'm sure your narration of the audiobook is going to be awesome. You're obviously a great storyteller. You really should just have a regular weekly podcast. I'm just saying. You got so much to say. You know what I mean?
Okay. So. Yeah. I'm going to receive that one.
Right. All right. Well, thanks, Tara. Appreciate you coming on the show, and I look forward to everything you've got coming out in the future.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for having me. It's been fun.
All right. Thanks a lot. We'll see you guys next week. Thanks for listening to The Archaeology Show. Feel free to comment and view the show notes on the website at www.archpodnet.com. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at ArchPodNet. Music for this show is called I Wish You Would Look from the band Sea Hero. Again, thanks for listening and have an awesome day. The Archaeology Podcast Network is 10 years old this year. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy, our social media coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht, and our chief editor is Rachel Roden. The Archaeology Podcast Network was co-founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in 2014 and is part of Cultural Media and DigTech LLC.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.